Alright, we're going to look at significant figures today. This is probably something that you haven't covered before, but when you're in a math class, you deal with numbers that are exact. In the science class, you deal with numbers that there's calculations that have gone into it that are measurements. So you can't report an answer more precise than what actually went into it. So we have to look at how to record it and record our answers to the correct number of significant figures. So the definition is it's in a measurement. It includes all of the digits that are known plus a last digit that we estimate. So where is our stopping point? Where are we going to stop measuring it? So we've got to look at first how to figure out how many significant figures are in a number. So there is a whole set of rules that you could follow for this, but there's something that I like to follow. It's called the Atlantic-Pacific rule. So on the next slide, I'm going to have a bunch of examples that we're going to work through together, but the rules for this, there's two basically. If we have a decimal that is present in the number, so if I have a number like 2.50, there's a decimal place present in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start counting at the beginning of the number, and I'm going to start with my first number that is not a 0. So the fact that I start with the number 2 means I start counting and that 2 is significant. Once I start counting, I continue counting to the right. So this number would have 3 significant figures in it. There's another rule if there's a decimal place absent. So if I have a number like, I don't know, 5,000, there is a decimal place absent in this. So in this case, I start counting at the end of the number, so down at this end, and I start counting to the left, and I don't start counting until I get to a number that is not a 0. So that's not significant, that is not significant, and that is not significant. So the only number that's significant in this is a 5. So we would say that that number has 1 significant digit in it. So I've got several examples that we're going to work through. On number 1, I have a number 150. So the first thing you need to ask yourself, is there a decimal present or absent? So in this case, it's absent. And the reason why I said the Atlantic-Pacific rule is, and I'm not very good at drawing, so we're going to pretend that is the United States right there. You have the Pacific Ocean over on this side. Can't draw a P. And you have the Atlantic Ocean over on this side. So if there's a decimal place present, you start counting from the Pacific side, the P side. If there's a decimal place absent, you start counting from the Atlantic side, the right of the number. So in number 1, the decimal place is absent, so I'm going to count in that direction. So I'm going to start with the 0, and again, I don't start counting until I get to a number that is not a 0. So I start counting at the 5, so the 5 is significant, and the 1 is significant. So I would say that that number has 2 significant figures. On the next one, there's a decimal place present. So I start counting at the beginning of the number, and it's a 1. So as long as it's not a 0, I start counting, and I continue counting throughout that number. So all 4 of those digits are significant. On the next one, I have another one where there is a decimal place present. So I'm going to start counting at the beginning of the number, the Pacific side. But in this case, the zeros, I don't start counting until I get to a number that's not a 0. So that 0 is not significant, that is not significant, and neither is that one. So those 3 right there are my significant figures. On the next one, I have a number that has a decimal place absent. So I'm going to start counting at the end of the number. Again, I don't start counting until I get to a number that's not a 0. So the 0 is not significant, that 0 is not significant. So I have 1 significant figure. That 3 is the only one that's significant in that number. The next one, I have a decimal place present again. So I'm going to start counting at the beginning of the number. So it is not a 0, so I start counting. So 1, 2, 3, 4. All 4 of those are significant in that number. The next one, I have no decimal place, so I'm going to start counting at the end of the number. I'm going to keep counting because that is not a 0, so all 3 of those are significant. So that's how to figure out how many significant figures are in a number. Our next video is going to cover how to do the calculations with significant figures.